My son's ex made him do 1,000 burpees for eating birthday cake, then laughed when he collapsed. When I played the recording of her saying I loved breaking him, she shrugged and said, "At least I upgraded." I walked away. That was 4 months ago. This morning, she had 47 missed calls from her therapist. When my son Jake came home and threw his basketball off the balcony, I knew something was up. But I also knew that if I walked into his room and asked what was wrong, he would do that teenage boy thing where they tell you to F off. So instead, I waited until the next morning to wake him up with a fresh omelet. Except he wasn't there. That's when I heard a grunting sound coming from the back garden. When I walked out to the shed there, he was on the ground, doing push-ups with sweat dripping down his face. He had just counted number 65 when he finally noticed me standing there. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something," he said. He told me what happened at practice. His lousy hoe ex-girlfriend had given his favorite hoodie to her new boyfriend Trevor, the captain of the basketball team. When Jake asked for it back after practice, she looked him up and down and said, "It actually fits someone with muscles now." Trevor flexed while wearing it, and the whole team laughed. I stared into my son's eyes, expecting to see some sort of sadness or heartbreak. But instead, I was met with a look of insanity. I'm done being the pathetic fat kid everyone laughs at. I'm going to change everything about myself. At first, I thought, okay, this might be good for him. Exercise helps process emotions, and maybe he needed this push. But within 2 weeks, he'd lost 20 pounds. His teacher, Ms. Thompson, called saying he was sleeping through the first period. When I asked him about it, he showed me his alarm history. He was getting up at 4 a.m. to run before his 5 a.m. gym session. Successful people sacrifice, he'd say with a straight face. The changes came fast after that. I caught him doing 1,000 burpees at midnight because he accidentally ate a piece of birthday cake at school. When his grandmother visited and made her famous lasagna, he sat at the table clutching his Tupperware while she silently wiped away tears. "I can't afford cheap meals," he'd say while shoveling dry chicken down his throat. "Did you know she used to make me walk behind her at school so people wouldn't know we were together?" His voice cracked. "I'm going to become someone she regrets losing." Within 2 weeks, he'd lost 20 pounds. And one afternoon, I did something I'd sworn I'd never do. I went through his journal. The second page made my stomach drop. Right there were the words, "My mom knew I was fat and never told me the truth." You see, his mom died when Jake was 11 from an eating disorder. She'd make him huge meals while secretly starving yourself. Jake found her collapsed in our kitchen. Her last words to him were, "You're perfect just the way you are, baby." Now my son was culling himself in the same way, convinced those words were just another lie. That evening I told him about a therapist that a family friend had recommended. "No, Dad, I hate you," I expected him to yell. But instead, he just silently nodded like he knew it was coming. And for weeks, Jake went without complaint. Dr. Liam said he was making excellent progress. Jake even started eating breakfast with me sometimes. I thought we'd struck this thing, until 6 months later, when the police called. They told me my son was trying to drown himself in Miller Lake at 5 a.m., but Jake wasn't trying to die. He was doing Navy SEAL training in 40-degree water, lips blue and hypothermic, still doing laps. When they pulled him out, he kept saying, "I'm not weak anymore. Tell Sarah I'm not weak." The paramedics said he asked them to check his body fat percentage in the ambulance. He was 119 pounds and 5'8". He was asleep at the hospital when Sarah showed up wearing his hoodie. She brought Trevor, who stood there smirking. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, but then added, "I was just being honest about the hoodie." Jake woke up while she was talking. He saw the hoodie and started laughing. Not normal laughing, the disturbing kind. "Of course you're wearing it," he said. "Of course you are." He wouldn't stop laughing. The nurse called for a sedative while Sarah backed out of the room. But even after they left, Jake's heart rate wouldn't stabilize. The doctor pulled me aside and explained that his body was shutting down. They started fourth nutrition, but Jake kept pulling at the tubes. "It's making me fat," he whispered. That night his heart stopped twice. They brought him back both times, but the doctor said the damage was extensive. He woke up once more. "Dad, am I skinny enough now?" he asked. I told him he was perfect, that he'd always been perfect. He smiled and said, "Don't lie to me like Mom did." Jake died at 3:30 a.m. The official cause was cardiac arrest due to severe malnutrition and hypothermia. I didn't say a word, not because I wasn't extremely heartbroken, but because I knew I had to make Sarah pay. I sat in my car outside the funeral home for 20 minutes, watching Sarah's Instagram story through blurred vision. There she was, Jake's hoodie draped over her shoulders, mascara strategically smudged as she posed for another selfie. The caption read, "R.E.P. Jake, you were loved," with 3 broken heart emojis. My hands trembled against the steering wheel as I watched her swipe through filters to find the most flattering one for her grief performance. The parking lot was nearly empty now. Most people had left after the service, but Sarah lingered with her friends, all of them taking turns hugging her while she clutched that hoodie like a prize. I noticed the dried ketchup stain on the left sleeve from Jake's last meal at home, when he'd finally agreed to eat a burger with me. That was 3 days before the lake. I stepped out of my car and walked toward them. Sarah saw me coming and pulled the hoodie tighter around herself, whispering something to her friends. They formed a protective semicircle around her. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I asked for the hoodie back. Just that, nothing else. Sarah's eyes welled up with fresh tears as she pressed the fabric to her face. She said it was all she had left of him, that she needed something to remember him by. Her friends nodded sympathetically, shooting me looks like I was some kind of monster. Trevor appeared from nowhere, stepping between us. Jake's former teammate, now Sarah's defender. He told me to get over it, that I needed to let people grieve in their own way. Behind his shoulder, I caught Sarah's expression shift for just a moment. The tears stopped. A small smirk played at the corner of her mouth. Then she leaned forward and whispered something I'll never forget. She said Jake had always wanted to look like Trevor anyway. The words hit me like ice water. I turned and walked back to my car without another word, but not before I saw her bury her face in Trevor's chest, the performance resuming for her audience. Jake's basketball coach intercepted me before I could leave. Coach Miller pulled me aside near the entrance, his face heavy with something that looked like guilt. He started talking about the hoodie incident at practice, how he should have stepped in when it happened. Then he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't the first time he'd seen Sarah do this. She had a pattern, he said, a pattern of collecting trophies. I drove home in a daze, but by the next morning, the daze had crystallized into something sharper. I couldn't let this go, not when Jake's death was already becoming her story to tell. The first time I saw her selling memorial bracelets was outside the school. She'd set up a little table with Jake's senior photo, the one where he was still healthy, still smiling. In memory of Jake, the bracelets read, $15 each. She was keeping the money. I watched from across the street as students lined up, eager to show their support. She'd even used his last Instagram photo without asking, the one I'd taken of him shooting hoops in our driveway just 2 months ago. My sister called that evening. She said people were worried about me, that I'd been acting strange since the funeral. Had I considered grief counseling? Maybe a support group? I realized then that Sarah had already started spinning her narrative, the grieving girlfriend and the unhinged father. I could see how this would play out. That night, I went through Jake's room more carefully. Behind his desk, wedged between old textbooks, I found a notebook I'd never seen before. My hands shook as I opened it. Page after page of dated entries. Not quite a diary, but something more methodical. He'd documented everything. Every cruel comment, every public humiliation, every time she'd made him feel worthless. The entries went back 8 months, starting just 2 weeks into their relationship. November 3rd, she said my laugh was embarrassing in front of her friends. December 18th, made me wait in the car during Emma's party because she didn't want people to see us arrive together. January 22nd, called me her practice boyfriend when she thought I couldn't hear. The next morning, Sarah's mother called. Mrs. Thompson's voice was carefully modulated, sympathetic but firm. She understood I was grieving, but Sarah was just a teenage girl who'd made some mistakes. We all say things we don't mean, and with college applications coming up, all this stress wasn't good for anyone. The threat was subtle, but clear. I created the anonymous social media account that afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just a place to document the truth. I started screenshotting Sarah's posts about Jake, comparing them to the cruel messages I'd found in his phone. The contrast was stark, her public grief versus her private cruelty. 2 days later, Trevor's parents invited me for coffee. The Millers were good people, and they looked uncomfortable as they sat across from me at their kitchen table. They were concerned about Sarah's influence on their son. Mrs. Miller had noticed changes in Trevor since he'd started spending time with her. Nothing they could put their finger on exactly, but something felt wrong. I kept digging. In Jake's backpack, I found more than just his calculator and study notes. Sarah had kept other things too. His team photo where she'd drawn hearts around Trevor's face, his AP physics notes that she was now using for her own class. She'd been posting these items on her Instagram stories as precious memories, but I noticed the price tags on some memorial items she was selling. She was profiting from my son's death in every way possible. Then Sarah's best friend Alexandra messaged me privately. She said she was scared of Sarah but couldn't prove anything specific. She'd watched Sarah destroy people before, but everyone always blamed the victim afterward. Alexandra deleted the message within minutes, but I'd already screenshotted it. My brother visited the following week. He sat in Jake's room with me, looking at the evidence I'd gathered. He suggested I needed to move on, that this obsession wasn't healthy. He mentioned that Sarah's family was considering a restraining order after the parking lot confrontation. The walls were closing in, but I couldn't stop, not when I kept finding more. In Jake's phone, buried in archived messages, I found texts between him and Sarah from when they were still together. She'd called him her practice boyfriend, directly to him, not just behind his back. The messages were dated during what should have been the honeymoon phase of their relationship. She'd been cruel from the very beginning. I started noticing Sarah with someone new at school events. Another overweight boy from Jake's grade, David Chen. She posted photos of them at the gym together, captioned with motivational quotes about helping him transform his life. The pattern was repeating itself right in front of everyone. Work became impossible. During a presentation about brand transformation, I found myself staring at the slide, thinking about Jake's transformation. My boss suggested I take some time off. I agreed, but didn't tell him I was spending that time documenting everything. The school counselor was my next stop. Ms. Price listened politely as I laid out my concerns, but her response was predictable. Sarah was grieving in her own way. Teenagers process loss differently. Had I considered that I might be projecting my own guilt? I left her office when I realized her daughter Emma was one of Sarah's closest friends. I followed Sarah to the mall one Saturday. I'm not proud of it, but I needed to see. She tried on designer clothes for 2 hours, Jake's hoodie tied around her waist the entire time. She laughed with her friends, took selfies, acted like any other teenage girl on a shopping trip, except she was wearing my dead son's hoodie like an accessory. The breaking point came when Jake's best friend Liam finally cracked. He'd been carrying guilt since Jake's death, and it all came pouring out over coffee. He forwarded me screenshots from a group chat called Drama King, where Sarah had shared Jake's most vulnerable texts. The messages were dated the night before Jake went to the lake. She'd been mocking his breakdown to their entire friend group while he was at his lowest point. Jake's grandmother noticed my obsession during Sunday dinner, but instead of discouraging me, she leaned in close and whispered that she'd seen Sarah laughing at the funeral. Not crying laughing, but actual laughter when she thought no one was looking. "That girl has empty eyes," she said, gripping my hand. The pattern became clearer the more I investigated. Sarah dated insecure boys, built them up just enough to gain their trust, then systematically destroyed them while keeping trophies of her conquests. It was sport to her. Then Nicholas reached out. Sarah's ex-boyfriend from freshman year had seen my memorial post for Jake. He warned me that Sarah destroys people for fun and that Jake wasn't her first victim. He'd spent years in therapy after their relationship. He'd been too scared to warn others, but Jake's death had shaken something loose in him. I screenshotted everything. Every post where Sarah profited from Jake's death, the GoFundMe that raised $8,000, the memorial merchandise she sold through her Etsy shop, the sponsored posts from fitness brands capitalizing on her tragic story. She was making more money from his death than Jake had ever made at his part-time job. Sarah's mother called again, this time with explicit threats about harassment charges. But that same night, Trevor's mother texted me secretly. "Keep digging," was all she said. The final revelation of this phase came from Liam again. He admitted that Sarah had made him deliver cruel messages to Jake, things she wanted to say but needed plausible deniability for. He thought it was just relationship stuff, normal teenage drama. He hadn't realized he was being used as a weapon against his best friend until it was too late. Sarah started a grief support group at school the following Monday. I watched from my car as she stood at the entrance, wearing Jake's hoodie like armor, greeting students with practiced tears. She positioned herself as the victim of toxic masculinity, explaining how Jake's obsession with appearance had destroyed them both. The other students nodded sympathetically, unaware they were being recruited into her narrative. I recognized her tactics immediately from Jake's journal. First came the isolation. She'd separate her target from friends who might intervene. Then the gaslighting would begin, making them question their own perceptions. Finally, she'd keep a trophy from each conquest, a physical reminder of her victory. Jake had documented it all with the precision of someone trying to prove he wasn't going crazy. The school janitor found me sitting on the bleachers after everyone had left. Mr. Rodriguez had worked there for 20 years and seen everything. He sat down beside me and mentioned he'd witnessed something the day before the hoodie incident. Sarah and Trevor had been in the empty gym, planning the whole thing. They'd been laughing about how they would break Jake in front of everyone. Mr. Rodriguez hadn't thought much of it at the time, just kids being kids. Now he couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried warning David Chen's parents the next afternoon. They thanked me politely, but explained their son needed the confidence boost a pretty girlfriend provided. David had already lost 30 pounds in just 3 weeks. They saw it as positive motivation. I left their house knowing I'd failed to protect another boy from Sarah's games. My documentation grew more detailed. I created timelines showing how Sarah exploited Jake's death for her college applications. She'd written essays about losing her first love to toxic diet culture, positioning herself as an advocate for body positivity. The irony made me physically sick. She posted excerpts on social media, fishing for sympathy and scholarship opportunities. A girl named Melissa contacted me through the anonymous account. She'd gone to middle school with Sarah and remembered a similar incident. A boy named Kevin had attempted sewer slide after Sarah's systematic destruction of his self-esteem. Sarah had called it being honest about his appearance. The school had hushed it up, and Kevin's family moved away. Sarah kept his Letterman jacket as a trophy. I maintained my composure at school events, documenting Sarah's behavior while appearing to have moved on. Other parents began noticing patterns once I subtly pointed them out. The way Sarah would loudly comfort David Chen about his weight in public, while her friends snickered behind their hands. How she'd post unflattering photos of him with captions about loving him despite his flaws. Sarah announced a memorial fundraiser for what would have been Jake's birthday. She planned to donate the proceeds to an eating disorder foundation, she claimed. I knew the truth. She needed money for her spring break trip. The fundraiser would legitimize her victim status while funding her vacation. I had to act before she profited further from my son's death. David Chen's sister reached out to me in desperation. She'd found her brother doing midnight runs in their neighborhood, pushing himself despite chest pains. He'd started weighing himself multiple times per day and hiding food in his room only to throw it away later. The same pattern Jake had followed. She begged me to help before it was too late. Sarah's mask slipped during an incident at a local restaurant. A server mentioned Jake while taking their order, and Sarah snapped. She complained loudly about people not letting her move on, causing a scene that made Trevor visibly uncomfortable. For just a moment, other diners saw the real Sarah, not the grieving girlfriend, but an irritated teenager angry that her meal had been interrupted by an inconvenient memory. She approached me the following week with an offer to co-host the memorial fundraiser. She thought it would show the community we'd healed and moved forward together. When I declined, her expression hardened. She warned that she'd make the event about toxic parenting if I didn't cooperate. The threat was clear: play along or be painted as the villain in her story. Her inner circle began fracturing when Alexandra caught Sarah practicing grief faces in the bathroom mirror. Sarah had been rehearsing different expressions of sorrow, testing which looked most convincing. Alexandra took a video before Sarah noticed her. The betrayal in Alexandra's eyes was evident as she realized her best friend's grief was just another performance. I discovered more lies when Trevor's friend Tyler shared old text messages. Sarah had been planning to take Jake's hoodie weeks before their breakup. She'd told Trevor it would be hilarious to see Jake beg for it back. The humiliation had been premeditated, orchestrated for maximum damage. Tyler felt guilty for not speaking up sooner, but had been afraid of becoming Sarah's next target. Sarah's control was limited to the school's social hierarchy and parents who enabled her behavior. She couldn't manipulate evidence or silence everyone who'd witnessed her cruelty. Her power came from people's reluctance to challenge a grieving teenager, but that protection was wearing thin as more victims emerged. Coach Miller had kept old security footage from the gym that he'd forgotten existed. When I convinced him to review it, we found clear video of Sarah directing Trevor on how to humiliate Jake. She'd choreographed the entire scene, down to having other teammates positioned to block any escape routes. The coach's hands shook as he watched, realizing he could have prevented everything if he'd just been paying attention. Jake's grandmother offered her entire life savings to expose Sarah's cruelty. Despite family pressure to let it go, she couldn't bear the thought of other grandchildren suffering the same fate. She'd lost 2 grandchildren, she said, Jake to Sarah's cruelty and Jake's mother to the same perfectionist demons. She wouldn't let Sarah create more victims. I began connecting with other families who'd experienced Sarah's manipulations. We formed an informal support network, sharing information and watching for new victims. Sarah couldn't infiltrate our group because we'd all seen through her act. We focused on documentation and protection, not revenge or threats. My approach remained methodical and legal. I refused to stalk or threaten, instead focusing on gathering evidence and protecting potential victims. Every interaction was recorded legally, every social media post screenshotted, every witness statement documented. I would expose Sarah through truth, not intimidation. The grocery store confrontation happened by chance. Sarah was shopping with her mother when we ended up in the same aisle. When I politely moved past them, Sarah made a comment about needing Jake gone to be with Trevor. Her mother gasped, and Sarah quickly tried to backtrack, but I'd already started recording on my phone. The admission was captured clearly. Multiple witnesses began corroborating Sarah's pattern of targeting insecure boys. Teachers recalled incidents they'd dismissed as teenage drama. Parents remembered odd comments their sons had made about Sarah. The pattern emerged clearly. She selected vulnerable targets, gained their trust, then systematically destroyed their self-worth while collecting trophies. Sarah's parents started distancing themselves as neighbors shared concerns. Mrs. Thompson stopped defending her daughter publicly after several families approached her with evidence. Mr. Thompson was seen arguing with Sarah in their driveway after David Chen's parents finally confronted them about her behavior. Community members connected dots about Sarah's manipulations across multiple activities. She'd left a trail of damaged boys through the yearbook committee, drama club, and student council. Each activity provided new hunting grounds for her twisted games. The pattern was consistent and undeniable once people started comparing notes. A parent network mobilized to monitor Sarah's influence on vulnerable students. We created a discreet warning system, alerting each other when Sarah showed interest in someone new. It wasn't about punishing her. It was about protecting potential victims from her psychological warfare. Trevor grew increasingly disturbed by Sarah's callousness. He'd started dating her for the social status, but hadn't anticipated the depth of her cruelty. When he overheard her joking about keeping Jake's hoodie as a victory trophy, something shifted. He secretly recorded her admission, wrestling with his conscience about what to do with the evidence. School parents who'd initially sided with Sarah began apologizing to me. They'd believed her victim narrative but started seeing the truth in small details. The way she'd smile when mentioning Jake's death, how she'd steer conversations to maximize sympathy. The calculated nature of her grief performance became obvious once they knew what to look for. Sarah's options narrowed as news of the Memorial Fund controversy spread. College admissions officers started asking questions about the fundraiser's legitimacy. Her carefully crafted victim narrative was unraveling as more people examined the timeline of events. The scholarship opportunities she'd counted on began disappearing. Then came the revelation about Sarah's freshman year victim. The family had stayed silent out of shame, but Jake's death gave them courage to speak. Their son had attempted sewer slide after months of Sarah's psychological torture. She'd kept his shoes as a trophy, displaying them in her room as vintage decor. The parents had photos of her wearing them in social media posts, smiling as if they were just another fashion statement. I worked to ensure David Chen got support without public humiliation. His parents finally intervened after his sister showed them the evidence I'd gathered. They pulled him from school for a few days and got him into counseling. counseling. David later told me Sarah had been texting him constantly, alternating between love bombing and cruel observations about his body. Jake's teachers and coaches united to share their regrets and observations. They created a presentation for the school board about recognizing signs of psychological abuse among students. Mrs. Thompson from English class admitted she'd noticed Jake's essays growing darker, but hadn't connected it to Sarah's influence. Coach Miller vowed to pay closer attention to team dynamics. Sarah's attempts to craft a new narrative failed as too many people compared notes. She tried claiming she was being bullied for grieving differently, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her social media posts contradicted her public statements. The timeline of her relationship with Trevor proved she'd been planning Jake's humiliation for weeks. Mrs. Miller witnessed Sarah mocking Jake's death during a sleepover at her house. She'd been bringing snacks to the girls when she overheard Sarah laughing about upgrading from Jake to Trevor. The other girls looked uncomfortable but laughed along, afraid of becoming targets themselves. Mrs. Miller stood frozen in the hallway, realizing the depth of Sarah's sociopathy. My reputation in the community slowly rebuilt as people recognized my restraint and focus on protection rather than revenge. I attended school board meetings, shared documentation with administrators, and worked within the system to create awareness. The angry, unhinged father narrative Sarah had tried to create didn't match the methodical advocate people saw. Alexandra finally found the courage to share more evidence. She provided screenshots of Sarah's college essay drafts dated 2 weeks before Jake's death. Sarah had been writing about losing someone to an eating disorder before Jake even went to the lake. The premeditation was chilling. She'd been crafting her victim story while actively driving Jake toward destruction. Jake's birthday approached, and I knew I had to act before Sarah's theatrical memorial performance. She'd planned a candlelight vigil with speeches about body positivity and toxic masculinity. The hypocrisy was unbearable. She intended to profit from the very insecurities she'd weaponized against Jake. The community began recognizing Sarah's pattern of targeting vulnerable boys for narcissistic supply. She fed off their destruction, collecting trophies and stories she could later use for sympathy and attention. Parents started discussing how to protect their children from predators who operated through emotional manipulation rather than physical abuse. I realized victory wouldn't come from destroying Sarah, but from preventing her from creating more victims. The goal shifted from revenge to protection. Every family warned, every potential victim saved. That would be Jake's true legacy. Sarah might never face legal consequences, but she could be exposed and isolated from vulnerable targets. When Sarah tried to provoke me at a school event, I responded with calm grace. She made cutting remarks about Jake's weakness, trying to elicit an angry response that would support her narrative. Instead, I simply documented her words while maintaining composure. The crowd saw through her act, recognizing the cruelty beneath her performance. The school board privately acknowledged concerns about Sarah's influence on vulnerable students. While they couldn't take official action without clear policy violations, they began discussing ways to address psychological bullying. Administrators started training teachers to recognize predatory behavior patterns among students. Truth prevailed as multiple families shared similar experiences. The stories were heartbreakingly consistent. Vulnerable boys targeted, systematically broken down, and discarded once Sarah had extracted maximum entertainment from their suffering. Parents who'd been too ashamed to speak up found strength in numbers. Sarah's memorial fundraiser faced cancellation after organizers learned about her trophy collecting. Someone leaked a photo of her posing with Jake's hoodie and other items taken from victims. The image spread through social media, showing Sarah surrounded by her conquest's belongings like a hunter displaying pelts. The fundraiser venue withdrew their support. In desperation, Sarah approached me with an offer. She would return Jake's hoodie if I stopped exposing her behavior. She tried to appear remorseful, but her eyes remained cold and calculating. I recorded the entire conversation, capturing her admission that she'd never felt bad about Jake's death, only annoyed by the inconvenience of maintaining her grief act. The evidence against Sarah mounted daily. Former victims found courage to speak up. Parents shared stories they'd kept hidden out of shame. Teachers connected incidents they'd dismissed as isolated events. The full scope of Sarah's predatory behavior emerged. Years of targeting vulnerable boys, extracting their trust, then psychologically destroying them for entertainment. Each revelation strengthened the community's resolve to protect future victims. Sarah's power had always come from operating in shadows, from people's reluctance to believe a teenage girl could be so calculatingly cruel. Once exposed to light, her influence withered. She could no longer hunt freely in a community that knew her true nature. The evidence compilation took on new urgency when Sarah's college scholarship deadline approached. She'd positioned herself perfectly, the grieving girlfriend who'd lost her first love to toxic masculinity and diet culture. Her essay about Jake's death had already won regional competitions. I knew the memorial event would be her final performance piece, cementing her victim narrative for admissions committees. That Thursday morning, I received an unexpected call from the school administration. They wanted to meet about the memorial fundraiser. In the conference room sat Principal Henderson, 2 school board members, and the district's legal counsel. They'd received received multiple complaints about Sarah's fundraising activities. Parents had questioned where the money was going. The administration couldn't cancel the event without evidence of wrongdoing, but they were watching closely. Sarah's preparations for Jake's birthday memorial intensified. She recruited the drama club to help with staging, convinced the choir to perform, and even arranged for local news coverage. Her social media posts ramped up, each one carefully crafted to maximize sympathy. She posted old photos of her and Jake, conveniently cropping out the moments where her body language showed obvious disgust. David Chen's condition deteriorated rapidly. His sister sent me photos of him at 3 a.m., running stairs at the school stadium. He'd lost 45 pounds in 6 weeks. When his parents finally confronted Sarah, she played the supportive girlfriend perfectly, expressing concern while subtly suggesting David just needed more willpower. I watched from my car as she hugged David's mother, then immediately texted David about his lack of commitment. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Trevor's younger brother had been recording basketball practices for highlight reels. While reviewing old footage, he found something he'd missed: clear audio of Sarah instructing Trevor on exactly how to humiliate Jake. She'd scripted specific phrases, planned the timing, even suggested having someone record it for social media. The boy brought the footage to his parents, terrified of what his brother had become. Mrs. Miller called me immediately. She'd confronted Trevor about the recording, and he'd broken down completely. He admitted Sarah had been threatening to destroy his reputation if he didn't comply. She had screenshots of messages where he'd admitted to cheating on tests, photos from parties where he'd been drinking. The same pattern: gain trust, gather ammunition, deploy when useful. I met with the other families in our informal network. We had testimonies from 7 different boys Sarah had targeted over 3 years. Each story followed the same progression. She'd identify insecure boys, usually overweight or socially awkward. She'd build them up initially, making them feel special. Then came the systematic destruction, always culminating in a public humiliation and a kept trophy. The memorial event was 2 days away when Alexandra made her decision. She couldn't stand watching Sarah prepare another performance. She forwarded me everything: years of messages where Sarah had bragged about her conquests, detailed plans for psychological manipulation, even a ranking system for her victims. Jake had been her masterpiece, she'd written, the one she'd broken most completely. Sarah must have sensed the walls closing in. She showed up at my house unannounced, David Chen waiting in her car. She wanted to make a deal. She'd return Jake's hoodie and cancel the memorial if I stopped spreading lies about her. When I refused, her mask finally dropped completely. She laughed about how easy Jake had been to break, how pathetic he'd looked begging for validation. I recorded every word. The next morning, David Chen collapsed during his pre-dawn run. His heart rate wouldn't stabilize, and doctors found he'd been taking dangerous combinations of diet pills and pre-workout supplements. From his hospital bed, he finally told his parents everything. Sarah had been texting him constantly, sending photos of male fitness models, asking why he couldn't look like that yet. The messages were relentless, calculated to destroy any progress he felt he'd made. Trevor couldn't take the guilt anymore. He went to his parents with everything: Sarah's threats, her manipulation tactics, the other boys she'd targeted. He played them recordings he'd secretly made of Sarah describing her collection of trophies from each victim. She kept them in a storage box under her bed, she'd said, labeled with dates and names like a serial killer's souvenirs. The Millers and I decided to approach the school administration together. We presented our evidence methodically: recordings, screenshots, witness testimonies. The principal's face grew paler with each revelation. The pattern was undeniable, the premeditation clear. They couldn't ignore this anymore, not with David Chen in the hospital and Jake in the ground. Sarah's parents arrived at school within an hour of being called. I watched through the office window as they reviewed the evidence. Mrs. Thompson's composed facade crumbled as she read Sarah's messages about Jake. Mr. Thompson had to leave the room when they played the recording of Sarah laughing about Jake's death. They'd enabled a monster without realizing it. The memorial fundraiser was canceled that afternoon. The school cited logistical concerns, but word spread quickly through the parent network. Sarah tried to salvage her narrative on social media, claiming she was being persecuted for grieving differently. But Alexandra had already started sharing screenshots. Other victims came forward. The truth spread faster than Sarah could spin it. Sarah made one last desperate play. She posted a video claiming she was being bullied to the point of considering self-harm, but she'd miscalculated. The community had seen too much. Parents who'd lost sons to her cruelty weren't swayed by manipulation tactics. Mental health professionals were alerted to ensure Sarah got help, but her victim card had finally expired. The school board called an emergency meeting. They implemented new policies about psychological bullying, mandatory reporting for teachers who witnessed emotional abuse, and support systems for vulnerable students. It wasn't called Jake's Law, but everyone knew why these changes were happening. Real change, not the performative advocacy Sarah had planned. College admissions season arrived, and Sarah's carefully crafted applications fell apart. Schools that had been interested started asking questions about the memorial fund, the canceled fundraiser, the inconsistencies in her story. Her scholarship opportunities evaporated. The future she'd built on Jake's destruction crumbled. Trevor testified to the school board about Sarah's methods. He detailed how she'd identified vulnerable targets, isolated them from support systems, and systematically destroyed their self-worth. He admitted his own complicity, but also revealed the threats she'd used to control him. His testimony helped other victims understand they weren't alone, weren't crazy, weren't weak. Sarah's trophy collection was discovered when her parents searched her room. Dozens of items taken from boys she'd targeted: hoodies, watches, team jerseys, class rings, each one labeled with a date and a cruel nickname. Jake's hoodie was at the top, marked "Practice Boy, best one yet." Her parents turned everything over to the families, their shame evident in every interaction. The community response was measured but firm. Sarah found herself excluded from school events, social gatherings, and activities, not through any organized campaign, but through the natural consequence of people knowing who she really was. Her power had always come from operating in shadows. In the light, she was just a cruel teenager who'd run out of victims. David Chen slowly recovered. His parents got him proper therapy, not the performance art Sarah had been conducting. He testified at a school board meeting about the manipulation tactics, the constant messages, the way Sarah had made him feel like dying was better than disappointing her. His courage inspired other victims to speak up. I returned to work gradually, my focus shifting from revenge to prevention. The parent network we'd formed became a model for other schools. We created resources for identifying predatory behavior, supporting victims, and preventing future tragedies. It wasn't the legacy I'd wanted for Jake, but it was the one that might save other boys. Sarah's attempts to attend community college failed when her reputation preceded her. Word spread through social networks. Warning posts appeared on college forums. She couldn't escape what she'd done. Her parents eventually moved her to a residential therapy program in another state, finally acknowledging the depth of their daughter's issues. The hoodie came back to me through the Thompsons. They'd cleaned it, folded it carefully, and delivered it with a letter of apology. I held it for a long time, remembering Jake's smile when he'd first bought it, before Sarah had turned it into a symbol of his worthlessness. The ketchup stain was gone, but the memories remained. On what would have been Jake's 18th birthday, we held a different kind of memorial. Former victims of Sarah's cruelty gathered to share their stories and support each other. David Chen spoke about recovery. Trevor apologized for his role. Other boys found courage to name their experiences. It wasn't the theatrical performance Sarah had planned, but it was real. The scholarship fund I established in Jake's name focused on supporting students who'd experienced psychological bullying. The first recipient was a boy from a neighboring school who'd attempted sewer slide after similar torment. He'd survived, unlike Jake, but carried the same scars. The fund would help him get therapy, support, and a chance at healing. Sarah's final message to me came through her therapy program, a carefully worded apology, clearly coached by professionals. She claimed to understand the pain she'd caused, to feel remorse for her actions, but even in her apology, she couldn't resist mentioning how Jake's death had affected her college prospects. Some people never really change. The other families in our network continued meeting monthly. We monitored for new predators, supported struggling students, and shared resources. What started as my desperate search for justice became a community committed to protection. Jake's death had exposed a predator, but more importantly, it had created a shield for future victims. Standing at Jake's grave with his returned hoodie, I finally let myself grieve properly, not just for my son, but for all the boys Sarah had broken, for the innocence she'd stolen, for the trust she'd weaponized. The hoodie would be buried with Jake, not as a trophy of her cruelty, but as a symbol of his true worth, finally recognized and honored. The ripple effects continued for months. Teachers became more vigilant. Parents paid closer attention. Students learned to recognize manipulation tactics. The community had learned a terrible lesson through Jake's death, but they'd learned it well. No other child would suffer what Jake had suffered, not if we could prevent it. Sarah's institutionalization brought no satisfaction, only relief. She was getting help, whether she wanted it or not. Her collection of trophies had been returned to victims' families. Her carefully crafted image had shattered. She was no longer a threat to vulnerable boys seeking validation. That was all that mattered now. I kept Jake's journal and the evidence we'd gathered, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder that predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they're pretty teenage girls who know exactly how to identify and exploit vulnerability. Sometimes the most dangerous bullies are the ones who convince everyone else they're the victim. The support group for Sarah's victims grew beyond our small community. Other schools reached out, sharing similar stories. We created online resources, warning signs to watch for, strategies for intervention. Jake's story became a cautionary tale, but also a catalyst for change. His death had meaning, even if the price was unbearable. 1 year later, David Chen ran a 5K to raise money for eating disorder awareness. He'd gained back healthy weight, found real confidence, and learned to value himself beyond anyone else's opinion. He wore a shirt with Jake's picture, honoring the boy who died before anyone understood the danger. Trevor ran beside him, seeking redemption through action rather than words. The changes in our community were subtle but significant. Parents talked more openly with their children about emotional manipulation. Teachers received training on recognizing psychological abuse. Students learned that cruelty disguised as honesty was still cruelty. The culture that had allowed Sarah to thrive slowly transformed into one that protected the vulnerable. I returned to Jake's room less frequently, but kept it exactly as he'd left it. A shrine not to his death, but to his life before Sarah's poison. His basketball still sat in the corner. His textbooks remained on his desk. Evidence of a boy who'd been happy before someone convinced him he wasn't enough. The final testimony came from Kevin, Sarah's first known victim from middle school. His family had moved away, but he'd heard about Jake through social media. He flew back to share his story, to add his voice to the chorus of survivors. He'd attempted suicide at 13 after months of Sarah's torture. He'd survived but carried the scars. His presence reminded everyone that Jake wasn't Sarah's first victim, just her most complete destruction. As I write this, Sarah remains in treatment. Her parents visit monthly, their own therapy ongoing. They've accepted responsibility for enabling her behavior, for dismissing warning signs, for prioritizing their daughter's success over others' safety. Their foundation now funds psychological abuse prevention programs in schools. The hoodie is with Jake now, buried beside him after a small ceremony with close family. It's no longer a symbol of Sarah's cruelty, but of Jake's truth, that he was perfect as he was, that he deserved love without transformation, that no one had the right to break him for sport. The stain is gone, but the love remains. Our community learned that monsters don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they smile sweetly, offer false support, and destroy lives while playing victim. But we also learned that truth, when finally spoken, has power, that communities can protect their vulnerable, that one father's refusal to let his son's death become a predator's profit can spark real change. Jake's legacy isn't the theatrical memorial Sarah had planned. It's in David Chen's healthy smile, in Trevor's determination to make amends, in the policies that protect vulnerable students, in the parents who now recognize warning signs, in the victims who found their voices. He died believing he wasn't enough, but his death proved he was everything. A catalyst, a warning, a shield for others. I still wake some mornings expecting to find Jake doing push-ups in the shed. The grief hasn't faded, just transformed. But knowing that Sarah can't hurt anyone else, that her future victims are safe, that Jake's death exposed a predator and protected the innocent, that brings a kind of peace. Not happiness, never that, but purpose. And for now, that's enough.